Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Augmented Engineering in Action session. My name's Scott Carey. I'm the editor-in-chief here at Lead Dev, and I'm going to be your host for this session and the other 4 sessions that we're going to be running every week for the duration of this series. I can see lots of attendees bang on time, so thank you so much for joining us live. We're also hopefully on the Augment Code YouTube channel, where you can be following along for this session and catch up later on if you don't get to stick with us for the full hour. I'm going to introduce our other panelists shortly, but just a reminder of what we're doing here. So I'm really excited about this series that we're doing with Augment Code over the next 5 weeks. What we're hoping to show you is to really peel back the curtain on how 5 different engineering leaders are using Augment and other AI tools to really change the way they're working. And the idea here is that they're going to actually show you what they've been doing in their terminal, in their Notion, in whatever they've been using. So you've got something you can really take away from it and really just learn from viewing. And so I think that's a good time to introduce our first speaker, James. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Tilt?
Sure, Scott. My name is James. I'm a staff engineer on the backend side at Tilt, and I work on the Cash Advance pod. Essentially, the Cash Advance is the leaping point. So Tilt is a credit lending company focusing on serving underserved markets. So we use about 250 data points about the individual to see where they could be and what their potential is, rather than what their past and credit score is, like non-traditional lenders do. On the cash advance team, we're kind of the first step of that credit journey. So we walk through linking your Plaid account, your banking account, getting some history on your paychecks, run that through some machine learning algorithms. We make an offer to you and get your cash out within about 3 to 4 minutes from sign up. And then later on, we progress you down that credit journey to more traditional credit products. Started using Augment not too long after the launch date and excited to be here and talk about it.
Nice. And where are you dialing in from today?
I'm out of Savannah, Georgia, right on the coast.
Nice. That's why you need a fan. And Matt, you're going to be joining me on all 5 of these sessions, but do you want to introduce yourself before we get started here?
Yeah, would love to. I'm part of the Augment team here. I'm a solutions architect in our go-to-market organization. I joined Augment a couple of years ago. Super passionate about developer tools. I've been in the space a little while, and just fascinated by what AI is doing within that space. So looking forward to these sessions and speaking with some fantastic folks like James.
Nice. James, before we get into like the real detail here, just tell me a little bit about some of the broader engineering challenges you've been facing at Tilt over the last couple of years, and then tell me a little bit about how you became introduced to the variety of AI tools that are out there at the moment.
Definitely. I think like all engineering orgs, we struggle with a couple different things. We have time zone challenges. You also have ramping up new engineers, the challenges behind that. We're more of a monolithic code base, so we're challenged to get individuals more comfortable on existing code patterns. And so really what drove us towards Augment and our other AI tools is earlier in probably the beginning of this year, we were challenged by our CTO, Justin, to form an AI enablement group. And essentially what that was a top-down mandate to start looking at what tools are available on the market, explore those, have permission to expedite the legal review process to get those tools onboarded and tested, and then figure out what value they have for the business. So I started using Augment, I don't think too much after the launch date. I was looking around on Reddit to see what tools exist, what makes different tools better, and got really curious about how the Augment context engine worked because that's one thing we struggle with being a larger code base. Tried it out. It was working really well. This is back in the Sonnet 3.5 days. And then once Sonnet 4 came out and now 4.5, it's just gotten better over time. So I think that's kind of how we got here is really just looking for tools that got us to where we hoped to be in 6, 12, 24 months. And it was more of a forward-looking vision than a specific challenge that we were solving at the time.
Nice. And then, yeah, how did you and Matt kind of start working together?
Matt and I believe, were working together early on during the onboarding phase. So we were working together on the proof of concept. That was kind of an interesting one where I think they gave us 12 seat license to try, and then before you knew it, it was 24, and then we were waiting on final we're waiting on final legal approval as people were beating down our door to use the tool. I think that was probably our first signal that we were onto something when instead of forcing AI adoption and kind of dragging people along and saying this is a top-down mandate, we were having people request license and then follow up hours later of where's this at? So it's been great working with Matt and the rest of the Augment team.
Nice. And I just want to, we're getting quite a few attendees kind of coming through now. So I just wanted to say that we're going to be hopefully taking Q&A with James towards the end of this session. And there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom client where you can enter questions. And I'm going to try and get to as many of those as we can during the session. So get them in as things prop up. And we will try and answer as many as we can live on the session. But James, I wanted to ask you, I think it's always interesting when you get a top-down mandate to use a tool, especially a tool like this, like Augment or like any of these AI tools that can kind of be applied to a variety of problems. Like, how did you start to identify the place that you most wanted, the nail that you most wanted to hit with this hammer?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think some of it you kind of have to look at what the tools are able to do. The tools are developing so rapidly. Sometimes it's really tempting to go after the next shiny object. But I think for us, getting in the IDE and experimenting with Augment, what we would do is rather than try to build out a tool set, whether it's our QA notes checker or a PR review bot, what we would do is we would just go into the IDE, give it specific commands over and over again, and see what it's good at. And then once we identify that it's good at something, then we say, okay, now this is worth the investment of actually making this a DevOps process that gets run automatically. Because getting it in the IDE is actually a really low lift. And it's actually a really good opportunity to test things in a smaller blast radius. So instead of blocking a dozen PRs a day that now everybody's upset about, we can test it with repeatable prompts and say, okay, why didn't it get this right? Why didn't it get that right? And then also we had a running Notion document where we would actually test the prompts, give comments on the output. And then that way we kind of A/B tested this being a DevOps tool no differently than what we would do if it was a front-end client-facing feature.
Nice. And you're going to show us a bunch of that stuff shortly, aren't you? We're going to get into your terminal and kind of start to check this stuff out. But I'm going to pepper you with a few questions first.
Perfect.
And so when you started identifying, like up front, you mentioned that the thing that stood out to you about Augment was the context awareness. And I keep hearing this in the market, like whenever I talk to engineering leaders about AI coding tools, they're always talking about that importance of context awareness. And how did you start to kind of build up that context awareness once you had Augment kind of in the door?
Definitely. So I think the early signs that showed us it was worth investing were just proof of life that we can give it a basic remove a feature flag end to end, it would nail this. And now these 5, 10, 15-minute processes were able to be done. And so that frees up a few minutes while it's running and blocking your IDE that you could say, okay, what else could I be doing with this time? The other thing that we were noticing is when the tool would get it wrong, it was often because the prompt didn't include the information. And so I'll get into the first step, which was the core concepts document. But how we got there was essentially we noticed mostly that our developers were struggling to understand the context and the intent behind code patterns. I think everywhere I've worked, we have 5 to 10-year-old code. Tilt's not quite that old, but we have legacy code that developers struggle when they're onboarding. So imagine you come into a huge code base and now we have new code, which is what everybody wants to follow because you wrote it, it's easier to understand. And you have the code that actually pays the bills. And we don't want to follow new patterns in the old code until we're mandated to do so. Like we want to make sure that it's actually failing before we do this massive refactor. And so to align our engineers, we started developing a Notion database of core concepts around things like database design, how do we use mediator patterns, how do we handle logging and telemetry, even things like that can really have an impact on cost at scale. And so we focused on that first, and that became the stepping stone for these later steps that we're going to talk through.
Okay, so like the promise of the AI tools kind of forced you to kind of get your shop in order a little bit with those core concepts, start to get that stuff written down. Was that kind of or were you kind of halfway along?
No, I think it was a combination of two things. I know, especially in the anti-AI Reddit or Twitter groups, there's kind of this concept of AI slop. And if you really take a look at PRs, and you get over that initial hurdle of like, oh, wow, this is a new tool. I'm going to blame it on the tool. And you think about what AI slop really means. I think a lot of the times it was actually just higher throughput of unknowns on the developer side. Sure, developers sometimes don't test their code because AI is faster or it looks correct. But I think really it identified just at a larger scale the underlying problem that people didn't understand what we expected out of them and what the quality expectations were around different areas of the code base. And so I think focusing on honestly just developer experience naturally flowed into making AI more powerful at Tilt.
Okay, nice. Do you want to show us some of these core concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's pull these up real quick.
Talk us through it. It's our first test of the demo gods. Pretty low. This should be, actually, I'm not even going to tempt fate. We're there. We're good.
We're good. So what I think would be useful, since we've got folks that might be wondering how do they get there, and I actually think this is one of the things that oh, demo gods are getting us. I actually think this is one of the things that I have to bite my tongue and not reply to every Reddit thread complaining that, oh, these AI tools just aren't doing it, they're not there. Is how you build this context engine and the fact that you have to invest in the tooling, otherwise you're not going to see any return on a lack of investment. And so, a couple things I'll highlight some of the things that are more agnostic to C# or .NET, our core language. But just take an example around like rich objects versus value objects. So let's say if you have a user and you've got a user coming out of your database ORM, you might want business logic living on the database model. If you're using Entity Framework and you're focused on rapid development, you might want to break that industry pattern so that you have much faster development rather than translating it into a service layer and then later translating it into a DTO. But it's critical that you explain that trade-off to developers. Or I've worked places that do it the other way, where you do translate a database object almost one-to-one to the service logic, and then you have methods that extend functionality on the service layer. But either way, in most cases, you probably shift from A to B, let's get this up and running very quickly, to now we're a larger, more stable dev organization. We're going to slow our development down to make quality more of a pit of success. And then you also have value objects like DTOs, which we want to be immutable. We don't want any business logic living on them. And so clearly defining those boundaries is one of the examples that we set. And then other things that aren't as much pattern, we do fifth normal database design. And so a lot of developers come into the org not fully understanding what that means. And so what we do here is we actually define what it is, make sure that all the team leads have actually reviewed the document. And then we give a very short and to the point example of what fifth normal form means and point to code examples of what that does at Tilt and good examples of the patterns that you should follow. And so this is kind of high level training the developer, but then we'll talk about a little bit later on how it flows into the PR review bot, that it also gives the bot examples instead of just saying this is wrong, to give a link to the documentation and say, this is not correct, but here's more information so that you don't make the same mistake twice rather than just that slap on the wrist that gets frustrating.
Yeah, and we'll get into that kind of PR review bot part of it, but like what just occurred to me, I was wondering is if this has had like a secondary impact on your ability to onboard engineers, like now that you've got all of this stuff here, but also like the ability to then just kind of like use an AI agent as part of that process. Has that kind of had a secondary knock-on benefit there that you maybe didn't envision?
It definitely has. Personal example from my team is we work a lot with shared code base with some of our Australian developers and some out of New Zealand. And so, especially this time of year, the time zones are very challenging. Very much looking forward to daylight savings change to give us 2 more hours of overlap soon. But one of the things that it really did is when we started writing these documents, everyone gave their opinion based on the code they're most familiar with. And then by putting it in Notion instead of a markdown file or some other source, it allowed us to comment and kind of challenge some of the patterns and say, okay, well, this works on your code base. I don't actually think you've covered all the edge cases. Let's talk through this. And it gave away asynchronously to have those conversations so that we would debate it once and then move forward instead of constantly rehashing it on every PR review because there wasn't a platform to go through it in detail.
James, curious, like, has this become part of onboarding for new developers? Like, do you find people like referencing this a lot to kind of resolve like conflicts and move forward approach?
Yeah, so for developer onboarding, one of the things we do really well here, I think, is we have your first 2 months essentially planned out week by week. And so you'll check in with folks from QA, iOS, Android, and then you kind of work your way up to what we call your first fake feature. And that first fake feature gives you an example, almost like an AI training agent on how to start to finish develop an API endpoint all the way through the database layer and see that working. And so this is part of that reading and onboarding that I definitely think we do really well here. And I also transparently think we benefit being in the .NET ecosystem where I think compared to other languages I've worked in, .NET tends to align really well just across the board because Microsoft's developer evangelist groups have invested so much time and money into getting those standards out for the community. It's been very helpful. So this document really just covers like the edge cases. But I would say more we use it is like a corrective. Hey, might want to give this one a reread. This is slightly off. I don't know that anybody actually reads them start to finish the way that you would like a manual or an onboarding document.
So with these core concepts, and you mentioned kind of the experimentation that you're able to do in the IDE to, start to find where you could really leverage AI and where it could be helpful. Um, what's like some of the first use cases that you identified could be something that you could go away and tackle?
I think early on we were focusing on feature flag cleanup. Once we were able to do that really well, we were able to do database design extremely well using Entity Framework. Basically we would say, this is an example entity. This is exactly what I want you to create. These are the fields. These are the examples. And then almost overnight, it did that really well. It would generate the EF migration script. And so we saw breaking down the PRs into small units of work that could be automated. And then at that time, we were on Sonnet 3.5. I didn't necessarily see great work in the service layer at that point. So that's where, again, the breakdown, do what it's really good at, get all your, let's say, mediator handlers, get your API controllers, things that are very pattern heavy written. And then I think once we did that, it was decently good at doing the PR review once Sonnet 4 came out. And we also saw like a lot better service layer work. One thing that we've noticed kind of at the tail end of that conversation with 4.5 is getting really good at writing unit tests that actually fully test logic and they're not just testing microscopic components. So it's actually been kind of fun to see how we leverage the tool to do small pieces and just over time that's getting larger and larger to the point now to where sometimes I can give it commands that, you know, I go have lunch and it's still working and it's almost done with a feature that would have taken me 2 days. And that's pretty cool to see.
Mm. So you mentioned PR review as one of the use cases there, and like you really saw that that became more effective when Sonnet 4 dropped. So
Mhm.
one side of it is like the technical feasibility and knowing that the AI can perform this task well. Um, Obviously, there's probably a list maybe as long as your arm of different use cases that you could do. So, like technical feasibility is one thing, but what are some of the other reasons that make you say, yes, code review is like the use case that we want to go and tackle? Is there like specific pains or things that, make you want to lean into that?
Definitely. I think consistency was key for us, making sure that our code reviews are consistent. I think there's also a team dynamic that has to be considered with code reviews and that I don't really see talked about enough. Like all the marketing materials for the off-the-shelf PR review products kind of talk about more the consistency side and catching bugs. I do think the human aspect is really important to consider of getting that feedback early in the corrective action and it not coming from a human. It just feels less abrasive. One thing I really like about Tilt is we do take the time twice a year to fly everybody around the world into one city, and we spend that time doing about 50-50 knowledge sharing and team bonding. We're actually excited next week to meet up in Vancouver for that. But you invest a lot of time in team bonding, and I think startups have always done this really well. And PR reviews, getting critical feedback every single day, if not done really carefully, can tear that down. And I think the other thing that you have to consider with that is it's one thing to say, okay, well, I'm just going to be a lot more kind in my PR review. There's also the reality that sometimes you need to go find those examples and point to them, and that takes a lot of time. And so it's also a balance between like kindness and how much time do I have, and if I'm in meetings, do I want to wait, a full day to give somebody PR feedback? Whereas the AI bot generally gets it the first time. Um, I did actually, that was kind of a neat exercise that I did with some of the folks at Augment, Matt. I'll pull up some stats here.
Mm.
Let me find these real quick.
Back to
Yeah,
the
this is,
demo.
what's that? Sorry.
Back to the demo God said to find the right document.
Yeah. So we actually worked together whenever the CLI was coming out of beta and going more to the public, and we wanted to find a way of measuring what the success looked like for our code review process.
Mhm.
And a couple neat stats that we pulled out of. We did see about a 30% bump in PR velocity. I think a lot of that is more the IDE tooling and getting more used to the agentic AI having better rules. But one of the things I really didn't expect and didn't even think to measure until talking with your team, Matt, was we saw about a 23.5% drop in the number of comments on the PR if we excluded the augment bot. So we were having a lot less corrections needed, almost a quarter. And then we also saw the merge time drop about 40% because, if somebody had to review in Australia or the US and fight time zones, usually that first PR review was more likely to be approved. And so I really think the 40% drop is huge, especially for an organization like ours, where a lot of our experimentation could take 2 to 8 weeks to bake in to see the impact. So it it was actually really eye-opening into the effect that it had of speeding up the review cycle.
Yeah, and James, we did get one audience question just asking, what's the size of Tilt's engineering organization? Because they're interested to know how this documentation practice might scale.
Definitely. Our engineering org, I believe, is around 100 developers. That does span across a couple of different locales between our Philippines team, Mexico, the U.S. product, and then obviously the geographic regions everywhere from the U.S. to South America to Australia, New Zealand.
That's a lot of time zones.
Yes, definitely favors our London and West Coast people. Much better for overlap than those of us on the East Coast.
Go on, Matt.
Yeah. How did you, I'm curious as you started to work on this code review, like, one of the benefits here, it sounds like you got a very, a team that's dispersed around the globe. One of the benefits is people can get a review much sooner. I mean, you mentioned Australia, that's probably about as awkward time differences can be. Are there any other motivations for adding in the AI here? I mean, you kind of reeled off a number of metrics of ways that it's kind of shortening back and forth in time, but I'm curious if you think that's just geographic or there's other factors here that was causing PRs to take some time before.
I'm probably leaning on the geography side of it more, being East Coast, so I have a little bit more pain point on that than those out of California do. Um,
Mm,
I do think consistency is key, and the other thing I would say is sometimes letting really small changes through on the database design part. Something small, like let's say if our naming pattern for foreign keys is that you include the table name suffix by ID, it's really easy to miss that in a PR review because it's the correct data type, it's the almost correct name. You see the word offer or cash advance on your model right above the word ID, and you just kind of connect the dots. But if you have to rename that in a large database, that's incredibly difficult and often requires downtime or multiple migration scripts. And so I really do think the consistency is probably one thing I don't hit on enough.
mm,
But not making that mistake, or at least having a first round of protection, because we do require multiple PR reviewers, but I'm sure everybody who's worked in a larger dev organization has experienced once you get that first check mark, I think the secondary reviews, just human nature is so and so reviewed it. I trust them. I'm just going to rubber stamp it. I'm in a hurry to get to a meeting or finish my sprint. And so I definitely think having the review bot be very consistent before the first human looks at it is probably something we don't talk about enough.
mm. Probably don't talk about it enough and maybe a little harder to measure the impact of that versus just velocity, right?
Absolutely. I'm probably not going to admit to missing anything in a meeting in public, but the reality is it happens. So it's definitely hard to measure.
Yeah. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how you started to think to put this together. I'm assuming this wasn't just a one and done, and that you kind of iterated at how to get to this point.
No, definitely one of the things that helped, and this is one of the things I do enjoy about being able to hire talent from all around the world is Paul, one of our other staff engineers who's based out of Melbourne, came from a company that only does deployment tools. And so as we were talking about it, he raised his hand and kind of helped me get the initial proof of concept up and going. In fact, like I think I knew the CLI was coming out in alpha because your team had kind of hinted at it while I was begging, like, please let us be alpha partners. Like, we've got this idea. And then literally within 24 hours, I went to bed. The next morning, I get a Slack message that, hey, check out this. There's a couple things that aren't working, but take a look at it. Um, and so I can kind of dive into how we plumb this up. It sounds like where we're headed.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Perfect. So we do have two things. We've been talking a lot about the review process and just code review. The other one we haven't mentioned that's a little bit newer, we're still working out some of the bugs, is a QA notes checker. So I'll just talk for a second about this one because it's a unique use case that um, I didn't even think of. But our QA team came back and gave feedback that a lot of times, being a startup, our tickets aren't what you would talk about at a conference. I think that's always important to kind of focus on. This is real world, this is conference presentations, and this is what we go through. A lot of times our ticket requirements aren't fully baked out, or we know a problem statement, or we know that conversion from A to B screen is not working, but we don't really know why. And so you dig in as a developer, and that 1 point ticket turns into a 3, 5, or a 7, and you finally get it done. You're exhausted. You want to commit the work and get a PR review. But the actual blast radius of your changes has grown exponentially from the time that you wrote your QA notes and you accepted the ticket into your sprint and when you actually post that PR. And so this was a neat idea to where not just looking at the code, we look at the linear ticket using the Linear MCP server, figure out what the QA notes say in the ticket, look at our code, figure out what our blast radius is, and make sure that those two things map. And so as an example, if I say that I updated the get user by ID endpoint, and now I've actually updated a create user and get user ID, it will call out that my testing notes aren't accurate. Or if I call out that we're going to test this in production behind a feature flag, it will actually call out unless I have somebody assigned to do that testing so that we know somebody has committed to doing that, not just putting it off and ignoring it. Um, but as far as how we wired it up, so we did use Docker. And I will say, if you're not in the Azure .NET hosting environment, the Docker might be overkill. The reason that we did it is by executing an Azure pipeline, we can run as a Microsoft identity, which what we're looking at down the road and just more forward thinking is long term, we would like to start letting the agent look at logs from production data or even hit a SQL database that's had PII extracted from it to do more of an on-call instant response. And so by starting out with the pipeline in the Azure instead of just doing it in GitHub, it allows us to execute as a service principal. So it will have the same authority as that service account in Azure. But essentially, what we have here is just we've got a PR trigger. We include any branches merging in to develop, and we exclude basic documentation. There's no real need to review that. We pull the code from a repository, and then a lot of this is boilerplate, just debug. But the magic happens down here to where essentially we take the Azure variable groups and we hydrate tokens that are secret on the Azure pipeline so that you can authenticate with all of the MCP servers. Um, Long-term optimization, we should probably just go ahead and have an image with everything pre-installed. But for now, to keep everything up to date and just lessen the workload, it installs it each time it runs. And so basically what we do is we execute the Augie CLI. One thing we learned, if you don't include the print variable, it does execute a little bit faster because you're not outputting everything that the agent does. But one thing we've learned is that inevitably a developer is going to challenge why did this happen or what happened. Sometimes it can be as simple as just the linear MCP connection broke or had a blip. And so by having print, even though it's a little bit slower, it allows us to dig into any questions around why did the agent behave this way. So I definitely recommend at least the first 30 days or a couple months that you're doing this to put it in full print mode. Model, we're experimenting with GPT-5 right now. I will say I'm probably going to switch this back to Sonnet just for speed. I'm not noticing like a huge quality difference with GPT-5. And I do notice that Sonnet, especially Sonnet 4 and higher, gets right to the point and does really well in our code base.
And if you're enjoying this, LeadDev has a ton more to offer.
I'm quite fond of the articles.
I feel like lead dev blogs are my favorite, and it's been really, really useful to kind of create these more meaningful connections as well.
If there's something you're struggling with as an engineering leader, there's a pretty good chance that LeadDev has published something that addresses it.
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.
And then this is a newer feature of the CLI, which I really like, is instead of having this massive wall of text that gives instructions on how to review the PR, and it makes where you have a ton of just fragile syntax issues, what you can actually do is you can have a hidden augment folder with a commands subfolder, and then you give commands in markdown files, which makes it way more comfortable to edit. And then you give them hints. And so you say, I'm passing in this GitHub PR number in this branch. And these are essentially variables. So they're not named add or with complex syntax. They're just natural human language variables that get referenced. And so you'll notice in my prompt here, I'm not actually calling any variables. It just intelligently connects the dots on what I gave it and how this is used in context. So we pass in the pull request number, the source branch. That way it can use the GitHub API, get all the deltas, know what branch it's on if it needs to look deeper. And then without going through the full prompt, I'll just kind of hit the highlights of what we've learned. One, I do think a summary is really important. A lot of the PR tools just comment on lines of code. I do think a summary with these are the higher level problems we found, such as there are some architecture problems, or maybe like these are all nits, or we're not following core concepts. Just giving that summary is really helpful to me before I dig into a full PR review and start looking at 20 comments. And then the other thing that I really think in general using AI tools is a good idea, but specifically on PR reviews, is when you know the tool. So if you know that Linear's Get Ticket MCP tool is worth it, I would highly recommend telling the AI agent what tool to get. I don't know that a lot of people kind of grasp this yet with MCP being very new, but essentially when you first connect to an MCP server, you execute a request to list tools, which essentially returns back like an open API or a Swagger documentation. It's now up to the AI model to figure out which of those tools or endpoints it wants to hit. And so if you already know that, there's no real reason to force the AI agent to figure it out every single time. Go ahead and tell it what MCP server you want to use, what tool you want to use, so that way it goes right to the point. And then you've got your print logs if it ever misbehaves. But generally, I've found that if you're that explicit, we don't run into this. But that's kind of like a high-level overview of how we got started. And I'll pause there to see if there's any follow-up questions.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is a very detailed prompt, right? Like we can see your scroll bar. We know that this goes on for a little bit. So would be curious, you've mentioned iteration, but like, how do you feel like you were able to learn how to prompt this effectively? And, how do you balance, adding more to the prompt versus maybe we need to refactor the prompt a bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think to answer that, let's rewind a little bit and take a step back from the PR and just talk about day-to-day AI use and making sure that it does what we want. So one of the things that we did is taking those core concepts documents that we talked about. Those aren't super actionable for AI. Like what we found with any AI tool is giving it explicit instructions is way more powerful than giving it theory. Humans kind of operate the other way around. Like, I want to know why you're asking me to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to challenge you. But so what we did is we asked Augment to review all of our Notion documents and create a set of rules. And so one of the things that rules do within Augment is, once this loads here, you have your rules and user guidelines. And so the rules you can load is either always, auto, or manual. And so as an example, We have a web onboarding tool, which has a little bit different auth and patterns. And so we've set that to automatic. So that way it's not bringing it into context every single session because most of our work isn't done in those areas. And then all of our non-negotiables are set to always so that every single time we launch a chat window, that context is fresh and it's readily available to the agent. To build all of those again, we had Augment summarize the Notion documents. And what we did is we went through line by line by line and we tweaked them. And we had that PR open, I'm not exaggerating, probably 2 to 3 weeks, getting everybody's feedback. And then what we would do is we would import these rules into a hidden folder, which again, you can see everything under the Augment here. The rules just live right here, and the always, never, or auto are just part of the header information of the file. And so what we would do is we would copy these over, let the agent do work. And then if something didn't work right, that seems like something, if it was a little more explicit, we could have made that work. What we would do is we would tweak the rule, update the PR, and just keep iterating over and over. That PR by the end of it had hundreds of comments. At a certain point, you kind of just have to say, you know what, it's good enough. Let's not be the enemy of perfect. And so what we did was we went ahead, we merged the PR, and then we started what was called a hypercare channel. I'll say this, any development that I've done, I think having a hypercare after a major feature release is always a plus. It allows you to kind of knock out all the big bugs over the next 2 to 4 weeks. And then that way going forward, you can focus on new problems instead of being peppered with bugs perpetually. And so we started a hypercare channel. The rules were basic. If Augment does anything that you don't agree with, you post a link to the session, you post a link to your PR and what you thought was wrong. And one of us involved in the AI Ambassadors program would take a look at it. We'd recommend a rule tweak and triage the ticket no different than a client-facing bug. That's how seriously we took it early on. And then what that allowed us to do is we could immediately address any problems. We created a code owners file in GitHub so that over time, like as we weaned off of that hypercare and people got more comfortable, they just needed somebody to post a PR and get approval. And once they got approval, then they could merge whatever they wanted and tweak it however they wanted. So that way it was more of a self-service. That allowed us to have a core group of engineers who painfully read every single one of these rules and debated them. But also we didn't block everybody else from contributing or make them, take a test that they've read every rule. So I think that was pretty powerful. And that was like the first step in getting the PR review really accurate. Your follow-up question around like, when do you know it's time to rewrite? So kind of a funny example with the QA notes checker is we noticed that it was actually hallucinating a bit and doing more of a PR review than QA notes checker. And we kept tweaking the rules and tweaking the rules. And we noticed that it just wasn't working. Like it was still approving or rejecting PRs, even though it wasn't actually told to do a PR review. And then somebody private messaged me and was like, hey, have you ever considered that you're calling your notes checker review this PR as the opening statement? And so then it kind of hit me that all of our language said review this PR, and AI models have been trained on what PR review means. And so we had to tweak our language because we realized that everything we were doing was actually tricking the model.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it leads me a little bit to a follow-up question here. So I'm curious what kind of expectations you and the team had in terms of, the efficacy and how effective this would be, right? I think for a lot of us, we're really looking for that moment of delight where it works every time and it's a one shot and it's a perfect review. And if it isn't, we consider that we must have to go and tweak our rules and there must be some way to make this happen, right? Probably, one of the pieces here is like you can end up creating so many rules, the model could look at them all and say, well, here's all the things I can't do. Like what can I actually do? And it could lead to some confusion with the model. So I'm assuming that sometimes there's not a perfect outcome. So I'd kind of love to understand about, expectations and what sort of bar you set for, we need to see this kind of efficacy for us to consider this to be a value add.
Yeah, I don't know that I've actually considered that. We've definitely hit areas where I think to myself, you know what, if I had to prioritize this the way that I would a client-facing bug, is posting a PR review comment that is wrong twice a week, the same value if it takes me the same amount of time as a client-facing feature. And there are times when the answer is transparently no, and we have to push back and say this just doesn't reach the level of concern to where we're just going to cut our losses and focus on what can we do next, bigger picture. So I think like every organization, we struggle to measure it. I read an article where something like 20 companies, including a lot of FANGs, are using just developer happiness and how they respond to the product is a way of measuring the efficiency of it. So I'm kind of at the stage of like, if the FANG companies are struggling with it, I'm probably not going to get it right. And so rather than worrying about measuring 30 versus 50%, I'm focusing on more of what's next. And for us, I think the next step is clearly more of the on-call and getting it to do stuff that I know it can do because I've seen it do it in the IDE. So I think I'm kind of avoiding that, like measuring with a nanometer and cutting with an axe.
Yeah, James, IARGO had a similar question here, which was just like, what does this mean for developers? Does it help them maintain focus on a single feature, or what does it do for their level of attention?
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like the level of attention and staying on a specific feature has gotten more challenging with AI. You know, even estimating, I don't know, you guys being AI driven, Matt, might have more insight on this, but even estimating is getting tricky for me because sometimes a ticket that would have taken me 2 or 3 days, Augment just knocks it out of the park first shot because I have the context, the prompt works really well, and then it looks like I'm sandbagging. And then other times I think to myself that the AI tooling is going to do phenomenally well, and something trips it up, and I end up having to do a lot by hand. And so a 1 point ticket becomes a five. So I will say, like, in the age of AI, where stuff's getting done a lot faster, and I think the product teams are being trained that things are out a lot faster, the expectations feel like they're rising to me. And I think the context switching, honestly, is something that's gotten a lot more difficult for me with AI.
Yeah, that's real worrying, that kind of rising expectation on the product side, and starting to kind of push that velocity. I think that I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, everyone's kind of figuring out like where this is speeding them up and where this isn't, and actually it's not consistent because these tools aren't consistent. And so you've got to you're starting to build intuition around it. You're starting to build up a bit of muscle memory, but we're just like right in the thick of it here. And so that kind of inclination to take one example and extrapolate it out and be like, this is how fast we can do things now, is one that you probably have to push the brakes on, right?
Yeah, and we're also thinking about tech debt a little bit differently, and we're thinking about the features that we touch the most, not just how extensible or how observable are they, how well do the AI models do on them? And so we have an effort coming up in the next quarter where one of the major drivers for refactoring some of the code is quite literally AI really struggles to maintain context. And that's honestly a driver, because if this is going to become our tool of choice and this is how we operate as a business, we do need to invest in making sure that we can use our tools.
Nice.
So James,
Sorry, Matt, you go.
yeah, I was kind of curious. So you've got the code review rolled out. You've iterated on it. We spoke a little bit about expectations and looking at the efficacy. Um, at some point, you started to think about how to measure this, right? Like you
Mhm.
opened earlier with some numbers on how to speed this up. Kind of curious uh, how you went about that, how you thought about it.
Definitely. It was a back and forth with the Augment team. You know, being a developer, not on the product side, I generally like building stuff a lot, but measuring it and monitoring it is often a challenge and something I do kind of out of need more so than enjoyment. So was definitely thankful to have a co-interest in measuring this coming from Augment, and getting some help. But essentially what we ended up doing is we worked on a Python script together that would hit our GitHub API and then collect those metrics in the preceding 2 or 3 month period before we implemented a certain tool. And then it would repeat the exact same steps for the trailing 2 to 3 months. And then that's how we ran those analytics to collect those numbers.
Hmm. Makes sense. So you're looking at like timestamps when the PRs open and close, the amount of comments inside a PR. Those are the kind of things that allow you to get to those numbers you described in terms of like mean time to close and how much back and forth interaction, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, great. I think you've alluded to this a little bit. You mentioned incidents. Is that something that you're thinking about next in terms of an automation, or what's on the cards?
Definitely. This one's a bit of a passion project that I'd really like to see this. I think the tools are there to where getting it done by the end of this year is very reasonable. So problem statement here is essentially when an exception occurs in production, generally speaking, we have the logs, we have the full stack trace, we know what version of our code that was released. So running tests locally, almost 100% of the time, AI tools know exactly where the exception is being thrown, and they know exactly what's causing it. There's some weird edge cases where, let's say you're using a library that doesn't have nullability enabled by default, and then ours does, and so you don't exactly know like how the NRE happened, but those types of things are very easy. And if you take that one step further of what obscures those, oftentimes it's feature flagged. So we're rolling it up at 1% because we knew it was risky, it was hard to test, whatever it might be, and we're just slowly ramping that up. And so the next thing that I think we do is we've got an MCP server for Launch Darkly. We create an API token that's read-only, so there's no destructive risk. And you take that Launch Darkly MCP server, and now you ask the agent, okay, you know where the code is within 2 or 3 places. Now tell me, when was that feature flag gated? And if that feature flag was recently enabled, you don't see any exceptions before that happened, then you confidently know that the feature flag being turned on or off or whatever it might be to a different variant is what's causing the exception, and you can post supporting evidence. I've seen that work numerous times just posting at my IDE. We can also take it a little bit further, and so we can look at telemetry within Azure App Insights. And so we know the events that we fire because that's in our code. We know the logs, we know where the exceptions are. And so we can also help debug exactly what the flow was that led into the method that caused the setup. And so we can give a situational summary of this is exactly what happened. And then finally, we know that the tools, if they have access to multiple code bases, such as iOS, Android, and web, they're really good at mapping this screen on Android or iOS hits this API that then jumps over to this backend controller. That's pretty simple for AI with where we're at now. And so I think it can also share what the user-facing impact is, not just the fact that an exception occurred that might not even matter. We've seen this work locally again. So I think the next steps for us are we want to set up an Azure pipeline to where it responds to a rootly, which is our alternative to PagerDuty, sends a webhook to let us know that something has happened. It gets that alert, parses the alert, which will usually have a Notion playbook on how the on-call person diagnoses it. We diagnose it. We look at the code to figure out what's causing it. We check the feature flags. We check the logs to see what's going on. And then we post an incident summary. Usually takes anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes to run this locally. So performance isn't perfect, but it's actually pretty good. And so you think about if I get paged when I'm outside on call for the day, by the time I get upstairs within a couple of minutes, I've kind of got like an on-call superhero doing the first level of work. So I'm not doing all the mundane task as my first step.
Nice. And then James, just for anyone who's kind of tuning in and they're thinking about starting down this path or starting to kind of adopt these tools, what would be your kind of parting piece of advice having gone through this process?
I think the biggest thing for me is make sure that you get top-down buy-in. Don't try to force it into my team's going to use AI tools and then it'll just spread. I really think you need to carve out the time to lay down the foundational rules. Otherwise, whether Augment or any of the other tools are going to struggle. And if you don't start out with the rules and building your context and getting all that buy-in from different teams to collaborate, you're going to get a negative first impression. And the amount of effort that it takes to overcome that is huge, especially when you're interrupting how people work and spend 40 hours a week of their life.
Yeah. Nice. We've also got time for a few questions here from the audience, so I might start firing them your way. James, you mentioned that people were beating down the door to get Augment. Like, how did this come about? Was it word of mouth? Was it progressive share outs by the enablement group? Like, where did that kind of beating down of the door come about?
I think it was a couple things. One is a company, originally this was more on the AI slop transparently, is we wanted people to put an AI um, label on their pull request if it was AI generated. And so I think what was happening is people were just saying somebody would post 7 PRs back to back to back to back, removing feature flags that would have taken a half day to just go through and tediously do it. And so I think just seeing that volume get posted, people are like, what's going on? How are you doing this? Then during our guild meetings, whether it was Android or backend, people were sharing some of the cool use cases. Transparently at that time, probably more of a positive spin than full transparency. And I think once people started seeing that and saw some of the cool use cases, everybody wants to touch the new and shiny tool.
Yeah, nice. And then there's another one here, like, which AI tools have you used and why? Are you using the same tools for front end and back end?
No, our front end team started using Cursor early on and built a ton of memories in Cursor, and they really like it. I don't know that there's a whole lot of difference on the smaller code bases. Like Augment's really good at the context engine, but on a smaller code base, I've used a lot of tools and they all kind of come out in the wash to me. Like I don't notice a big quality difference. On monoliths, absolutely, I've got my favorite tools, but I think on the smaller code bases, you don't notice as big of a difference. And our attitude's kind of been, we could argue whether they should use Cursor or Augment, but at the end of the day, if they're using AI tools and getting value out of them, dictating which tool to use probably has more negative impact than good.
Yeah, and there's another one here. Like, do you use Augment for non-coding tasks?
Definitely. I've got a couple examples. One is we just switched over our domain. And so we exposed Augment to our IT group. And so they got a ton of value out of doing the migrations between moving email accounts over between domains and building those scripts out. The other thing that we've probably seen the most reward for all the training we do is, again, we do lending at Tilt. And so a lot of our tweaks might be make this small change to the client onboarding with how an offer is presented. But then what you really have to do is you have to monitor that data over the next 2 to 3 months to see what the repayment rate was, and also based on like how much we lend controls what our profitability is, and we have to balance that with the repayment rate. And so one thing that we've used Augment for on the product side is they're now using it for product monitoring and actually looking at data from Amplitude, which goes into our Databricks data warehouse, using the Databricks MCP server to say, okay, for clients who went through this experience, what was the profitability, what was the repayment rate, and they're developing some pretty gnarly data analysis within a couple of hours that would have quite literally taken days or a week to do if they didn't have access to an AI tool, and most importantly, the MCP servers to connect all the dots without having to manually do it.
Nice. Got another one here. How long did it take you to iterate on the PR review MD instructions, or is there boilerplate to give you 80/20 on the documentation?
Yeah, that's a good question. We started out with another tool for PR review, so we had about a year head start, and then we wanted better context to get more specific. So I would definitely say it's a several month process. Like I don't want to sugarcoat it to think that you're going to be up and running in a couple of weeks. If you want to get started and just want to see how can this work for you without putting a ton of effort into it, just give it a one line, catch any and all hidden bugs, and things like flipping around greater than or equals to sign or catching null reference exceptions that you're not protecting yourself against. Those types of things with just one command, it's shockingly good at. So I would start with stuff like that and then work your way up to using MCP servers or more like design level code review.
Sweet. And then how are you measuring the efficacy gains via Augment?
I hit on that a little bit earlier. So the PR review, we have tangible numbers of how we're impacting that. Transparently, I think you could argue that maybe PRs have become smaller, and so we're skewing the metrics because people are using Augment to generate the database model, get that reviewed, go through. So we could debate over that, like 30% bump in velocity is completely real or not. Even if we consider it 15% over 100 developers, that's pretty significant. But then as far as just how are we measuring it across day-to-day coding effectiveness, I don't have a great answer for that. And I don't even have a path to getting a good answer. I'm hoping some of the larger dev orgs start coming out with ideas and we can latch onto that. But I think most of my focus for now is tackling things like the on-call that we talked about a little bit more so than measuring. I think we know it's helping, but getting an exact number, I don't know how to do that. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it.
Yeah, it sounds to me like that's not how you like to spend your time anyway, to be honest.
Right, definitely.
One question I had is you mentioned a couple of times like the iterations of the models. You were like, we noticed this when Sonnet 4 came out. We noticed this when we shifted to GPT-5. Now we're going to go back to Sonnet. Like, how do you stay up to date with all that stuff? And how do you kind of start to measure the efficacy of one versus the other?
Yeah, I think that's challenging. Another tool that we had used exposed probably a dozen plus models. And one of the things that I personally noticed is I felt like we were spending more time playing with the tools than playing with the models. And we would have very subjective comments around, oh, this is much better, or that's much better. And then you ask for a PR example and you can't really get one. So you kind of learn like, I think sometimes all being nerds at heart, we want to play with new tools and say like, oh yeah, this is amazing, this is not amazing. One of the things I liked about Augment early on was they didn't expose the model picker. Again, this gets to the edge of my understanding of the tooling, but if they have a context engine that we know has to be tweaked based on new models getting released, it seems to me like this is more of a build versus buy conversation. And I think one of the hardest things in software, obviously in AI too, but like in general with software, I think as developers, we always want to like build it in-house or have our own opinions in-house. And I do think there's a certain level of maturity that comes with saying, you know what, these guys have a lot of funding. They've hired a lot of very smart people focused on one very specific thing. At a certain point, to me, it makes sense to trust your tooling and let them do that testing than putting it all in-house and trying to learn something that you might not be familiar with.
Yeah, hard-worn lesson, that one. Let the experts be the experts, and then you worry about what Tilt does, you know?
Definitely, yeah. I think with like GPT versus Sonnet and like the ones that they release and then forming an opinion, that's a little easier because I've tried GPT-5 with hobby projects that don't have as large of a context. The speed isn't nearly the problem, and the reasoning seems a little bit better than Sonnet 4.5. But then with our large monolith, you can compare the two with any one-shot prompt that you have, and 9 times out of 10, Sonnet's going to do it in like a fifth of the time. So I don't have like a crazy review process that's super enlightening. To us, it was just that big of a speed difference. And we're not really vibe coding the way that we're using agentic mode. We're more giving it very explicit prompts with very explicit examples. And so I really don't think a lot of the benefit of GPT-5's reasoning over Sonnet matters to us because we're giving it so much context. We just want it to type it faster than we can.
Yeah, nice. All right, well, that is all we've got time for today, but you've also given me a great segue to kind of pitch our next session next week, because we're sitting down with Dan Van Tran, the CTO at Collectors, and he's going to be talking a lot about how they assess different models and different tools, and they've built out quite a good framework for starting to do that assessment. So James, I hope you tune in. I hope everyone who tuned in today tunes in. But yeah, James, I just want to thank you for kind of jumping on today and really talking us through all this stuff. It's been really cool to see all the work that you've been doing and getting through there. And I wish you the best of luck with the next kind of set of challenges that you're going to attack here. But yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. It's been fun joining you guys and talking about this. I look forward to the next part of the series.
Thank you. Matt, any last words before we get out here for one more week?
Just to echo your thoughts, thanks very much, James. It was incredible to hear the Tilt story. I think we all learned something today, and yeah, Scott, looking forward to next week as well.
Sweet. Well, thanks everyone, and see you next week. Cheers.
Bye.